Stay tuned for a channel update at the end of the video. Around the mid to late 90s, many franchises which were well established by that point were about to make a big transition into unknown territory, translating their characters, gameplay, and general art style into the third dimension. It's not like 3D technology was completely non-existent by this point. In the early 90s, Wolfenstein 3D and Doom already demonstrated the possibilities. And even in the 80s, there already existed pseudo-3D games which used 3D assets and camera positions to look 3D, though technically these are considered to be 2.5D. And even the aforementioned Wolfenstein, Doom, and later Duke Nukem still relied on flat sprites, or billboards as they're called in the industry. It's hard to pinpoint exactly which game is the first true 3D game, but Quake, released on June 22, 1996, was the first game to use full 3D objects for all props and characters, beating Super Mario 64 to the punch by one day, though that game still uses 2D sprites for stuff like collectibles and even trees. Even Nintendo already made their leap into the third dimension years before with games like Star Fox on the SNES, but unlike games which saw their inception as a 3D title, many franchises made their debut in 2 dimensions. With the release of the Nintendo 64, Mario was Nintendo's first candidate to show off the potential, and well, given the game's legacy, it's safe to say that they absolutely nailed it. It single-handedly laid the groundwork for all future platformers to come, and the team at Nintendo made it look almost effortless. However, during this transition period, it quickly became apparent that it wasn't always smooth sailing for every franchise. Some games just seemed like they were meant to be played in 2D, and in the case of Metroid, for example, it wasn't until the next gen that Nintendo finally felt comfortable to make the transition. But we're not here to talk about those games. This is a video about Zelda. And just like Mario, Nintendo's second most popular franchise made a perfect transition into the third dimension, blowing the competition out of the water with Ocarina of Time. But as is with all bold new changes, not everyone prefers the new direction. To this day, A Link to the Past is still considered by many to be their favorite Zelda game of all time. And although Ocarina adapted a lot of the themes, story beats, and concepts from its predecessor, it's undeniable that the experience is radically different. Luckily, Nintendo never forgot about the old school approach and continues to release Zelda games in the classic style alongside the 3D titles. The 2 different styles have coexisted ever since. But I think it's safe to say that in terms of popularity, the 2D/top-down games have kind of been living in the shadow of their bigger brothers. With the choice between more than 20 games, and with the exception of the classic games, which still hold a lot of nostalgic value for people, the majority of Zelda fans seem to prefer the 3D installments over its top-down counterparts, if they had to make a hard choice. We just don't see the same level of hype as with the announcement of a 2D game. Now, I do realize that polls like these don't represent the most accurate result, but I didn't want to draw conclusions on the popularity of the two based on sales numbers, because sales numbers are heavily influenced by a lot of different factors, such as the popularity of the system it released on, how many systems it released on, the time of release, and the pricing. As an example, Link's Crossbow Training actually sold more copies than Skyward Sword, but I don't think anyone would claim that Crossbow Training is the better game. Now, who am I kidding? Of course, it's far superior to Skyward Sword. Joking aside though, this obviously had to do with the fact that the Wii was brand new at the time, and that the game was bundled together with the Wii Zapper for a cheaper price. So in this case, I think asking the general public for their opinion presents a more honest answer. And the margin of the polls don't lie. The 3D games are by far more popular. This is in stark contrast to some of Nintendo's other franchises, as there are plenty of people who prefer 2D Metroid over the Prime series, or choose the classic side-scroller style of Mario games over the 3D platformers. Anyway, with everyone now focused on Breath of the Wild 2 and the soon-to-release Hyrule Warriors: Age of Calamity... How does he even stay up and... He's way too heavy. Oh, I can't. Excuse me. Like I said, with everyone now focused on these upcoming titles, I want to give some love to the other side of the Zelda fandom and discuss the beauty of these games, its game design, as well as the advantages and disadvantages one has over the other. So without further delay, let's dive into the beauty of top-down Zelda games. First off, I want to clarify that although games like Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, and A Link Between Worlds also use different vantage points and camera angles, I still categorize these under the same umbrella as the other top-down installments, since the majority of its gameplay is still experienced from a bird's-eye perspective. In order to prevent myself from going all over the place, I've divided the subject matter into 6 different categories: accessibility, difficulty, combat, story, dungeons, and exploration. So let's start from the top and work our way down, starting with... For the average veteran gamer out there, getting into a 3D game is no biggie, especially for those who grew up after the 5th generation of consoles. But for the majority of the people on the planet, this is a whole different story. Just boot up Breath of the Wild and hand over the controller to someone who has little to no experience in gaming, and you will see how hard it is for them to get a grip on it. 3D games demand a lot more spatial awareness, not to mention the control scheme is often a lot more complicated. The 2D titles are much more straightforward and a lot easier to comprehend for your average player. Mind you, this doesn't mean that the game is easier to complete, something we'll get into next. But only 2 axes and a more clear overview of where you are in the space around you is definitely a lot less overwhelming and thus more accessible. The simplicity of top-down Zelda is something I've always admired about it. There are of course games like A Link Between Worlds which require a lot more spatial awareness due to its wall merging mechanic, and for that reason alone I would never recommend it to an unexperienced player as their first top-down Zelda game. But it's still a lot easier to get into than, say, Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword. Again, easier to control, not to finish, which leads into... The flip side of this easy-to-grasp gameplay concept is that despite the fact that the games look a lot easier, any veteran Zelda player out there knows that the opposite is true, in most cases. In fact, up until Breath of the Wild, the 3D titles had been plagued by a rather low difficulty. A little too low for my taste, actually. And even Breath of the Wild stops being hard after, say, 10 hours of gameplay. The 2D games have never been afraid to get really difficult, and this can be both a blessing and a curse. For some, the higher difficulty might be a big turnoff. No matter your preference though, I think there's a certain beauty to the fact that these games aren't afraid to pose a good challenge to any player regardless of age or experience. With the exception of maybe the first Zelda on NES, the games generally don't start off too hard. If we take A Link to the Past for example, it isn't until the turning point of the game after getting transported to the Dark World that the difficulty suddenly ramps up significantly. Enemies are suddenly way stronger and deal a lot more damage. The Dark World truly hits hard during a first playthrough. But by that point you've already had plenty of time to get some good practice, and with some perseverance you will be able to deal with the challenges ahead. The only 3D title which comes close to this is Ocarina of Time, and it's blatantly obvious just how much inspiration this title took from A Link to the Past. The child section of the game is pretty easy, but as soon as you become an adult the game makes a radical change. Dungeons are suddenly a lot bigger and more complex, enemies more dangerous, and even the overall atmosphere communicates a certain message of "you're an adult now, playtime is over." It's by no means as hard as A Link to the Past's Dark World, but definitely came the closest. Unless you count Majora's Mask, which was weird, confusing, and hard to get into from the moment you booted up the game, but yeah, that's Majora's Mask for you. But even then, most of the difficulty from the 3D games comes from that spatial awareness I was talking about earlier and some of the puzzle elements that come with it. But in terms of actual survival, the top-down games are definitely in a league of their own. My very first Zelda game was Ocarina of Time, and even on my very first playthrough, I must have died only around 5 or 6 times. I didn't play A Link to the Past until after Majora's Mask, in the gap between Majora and waiting for the Wind Waker to come out. And, oh boy, safe to say I died a lot. But after finishing it, I was hooked, and immediately picked up Link's Awakening right after and finished both the Oracle games as well. So that's 4 classic top-down Zelda games I tackled in less than 2 years' time. You can imagine that when the Wind Waker came out, the challenge of that game was kind of underwhelming to say the least, coming off of Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and then 4 very challenging 2D titles. Which brings us to the next segment. The main culprit for the higher difficulty found in the top-down games is death. A lot of deaths. These games can be absolutely unforgivable. They are by no means among the hardest games out there like Castlevania or Ninja Gaiden, with the exception of Zelda 2, which we don't talk about here, but they are miles ahead of the 3D games. I think this has to do with the whole Z-target lock-on system. The enemies in the 3D titles are generally designed and programmed to be tackled one by one. I mean, look at this. What's this other guy doing? Why isn't he attacking me? In the top-down games, enemies don't care. They will gang up on you and eat your Hylian ass for breakfast if you're not careful. For me personally, this is one of the most fun aspects of these types of Zelda games. You enter a room full of enemies and you gotta make quick decisions. How do I navigate the room safely? What are my escape options? Which enemies should I attack first? Do I get rid of the weaker enemies to clear some room to move? Or do I go straight for the stronger ones? Or the ones who litter the room with projectiles? Funnily enough, this type of combat challenge has also been proven to work in the 3D games as well, with places like the Savage Labyrinth, the Cave of Shadows, and more recently the Trial of the Sword in Breath of the Wild, where you actually have to study the room and plan your tactics ahead of time instead of just mindlessly picking off enemies one by one like in the regular dungeons. But for some reason, this is mostly saved as an extra optional challenge in the 3D installments. Another thing that contributes to the combat being harder in the top-down games is that your window of invulnerability is a lot less lenient, as is the hit stun on enemies. If you're not careful or impatient, you can get comboed to death real quickly, and some enemies cannot just mindlessly be wailed on as they have little or even no hit stun at all. Compare a Dark Nut from the first game to the ones from Twilight Princess or The Wind Waker, and it becomes clear just how brutal they used to be. It's always moving and predicting where they will go next and what your optimal approach is without the risk of getting in its path is hard. In the 3D games, it's just a matter of blocking and parrying at the right moments, which honestly is more about patience than it is about skill. I think you get the point, so let's go into something completely different. Zelda games have historically been more about gameplay first, story second, and the 2D games definitely live and breathe that mentality. The story in these installments can be very interesting, but at the same time it also keeps it very simple. And because of its art style and text-based conversations, they are definitely not on par with the other games in terms of cinematics. The 3D games simply feel bigger and more epic, even if the total amount of gameplay hours of a top-down game is the same or even longer. Seeing a cute little sprite perform all these funny little movements while you read the dialogue box underneath definitely has its charm, but I can totally see why people aren't as invested in the story of these games than they are with the others. However, if there's one thing the top-down games have over the rest, is that they are much more experimental and dare to take a lot more risks. Think about it. The only 3D title that doesn't take place in Hyrule is Majora's Mask. I mean, okay, in Skyward Sword, Hyrule technically hasn't been founded yet, but it's still in the same geographical location. Compare that to the 2D games, which have Holodrum, Labrana, Koholint Island, New Hyrule, and yes, I will even count Hytopia, all brand new kingdoms to explore. The same thing goes for villains. Only 2 of the 3D titles don't feature Ganondorf as the main bad guy. Sure, we have supporting villains like Girahim and Zant, but compared to the 2D titles, this is still child's play. Vati, Bellum, Malladus, Varon, General Onox, the Nightmare from Link's Awakening, the Lady, and a fair share of new supporting villains like Yuga and Chancellor Cole. It seems like in terms of variety in story narrative and characters, the 2D games are the place to be. And I don't exactly know why. Perhaps because Nintendo views the 3D titles as the more important mainline games now, they are more afraid to step away from the norm and take risks than they do with the other games? It's hard to say for sure. This also goes for certain gameplay elements. There's a lot of talk about Breath of the Wild 2 possibly featuring co-op mode between Link and Zelda, which would be a first for the 3D titles. Meanwhile, the 2D games have been experimenting with multiplayer since the first 4 Swords, and if Breath of the Wild 2 doesn't feature co-op but rather sees you switching between Link and Zelda, that too has already been done to a certain degree in Spirit Tracks. Granted, this last aspect doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the story specifically, but I didn't know where else to include it, so I thought I'd just mention it here. Dungeons are a very subjective matter when it comes to Zelda. I am personally torn in terms of which style I like the most, though I will say that the imposing size and complexity of the 3D dungeons does speak to me just a little bit more. but not by a large margin. There are plenty of 2D dungeons which I vastly prefer over some of the 3D ones. However, the biggest strength of the 3D dungeons is the variety in their aesthetics and atmosphere. With the more recent top-down titles, this definitely has improved, and dungeons no longer feel like simple palette swaps. But I'd still give the edge to the 3D installments in that department. There's just something about experiencing a dungeon from all angles that makes it stand out more. But again, like with the story, the 2D games have been a lot more experimental in terms of actual dungeon mechanics. If I look back at just how crazy these dungeons can get sometimes, I can't help but feel inspired as someone who loves talking about game design. So many different mechanics which completely change the way you approach these challenges, making an entire floor crash into the floor below to access new areas. Throwing ice down a shaft to freeze the floor below, using certain switches to loop around the dungeon, having to travel between 2 different dimensions to progress further. Some dungeons are about finding loads and loads of keys, and not all keys are required to beat the dungeon, whereas others barely feature any keys at all. I don't know why, but it just feels a lot easier to get lost than having to think outside the box in these dungeons than it is in the 3D installments. In those games it can feel a lot more formulaic at times, emphasis on most of the time. There are definitely exceptions. Additionally, sometimes dungeons in the 2D games also feature multiple exits and entrances, which in the example of Skull Woods, the dungeon is entirely designed around, something that's a lot more scarce in the other games, and is never utilized to this extent. In general, there's also a lot more optional rooms in these dungeons as well. And, you know, I get it. Designing an entirely optional 3D space which the player might never visit can feel like a waste of precious development time. But that doesn't take away from the fact that this does make the dungeons in the top-down games feel a lot more of a challenge overall. Again, I want to emphasize that these are generalizations. There are very simple and straightforward 2D dungeons and very complex 3D ones. Last but not least, I want to touch upon exploration. Now, I could never say with a straight face that the exploration in any of the 2D games is better than the one found in Breath of the Wild. At the same time, the reason why Breath of the Wild's exploration is so amazing is exactly because it wanted to capture the feeling of the first game on the NES, so there's that. But aside from Breath of the Wild, a lot of the overworld exploration in the 3D games before was heavily toned down. Skyward Sword. Alright, to be fair though, this isn't entirely the fault of the games themselves. 3D games demand a lot more power in terms of hardware, and up until Breath of the Wild, the technology just wasn't there. The worlds needed to be bottlenecked and divided up into chunks to make it work. But if there's anything the top-down games have over its 3D brothers, it's that the secrets feel a lot more secret-like. Especially in the earlier games, because each screen was more self-contained, it was much easier to hide stuff in very random spots, without making it impossible for the player to find. Caves, chests, and sometimes even a dungeon could be hidden under a seemingly random bush, rock, or inside of a wall. And because you're viewing the world from a bird's-eye perspective, the game designers have an easier time placing subtle hints in the terrain assets. Something that's a lot harder when you're viewing the world from behind the protagonist or from first person. Try hiding a big secret in a random bush or patch of grass in Breath of the Wild. Yeah, that'll go over well. In general, it's a lot harder to miss stuff in the top-down games, since all the information is laid out in front of you. Whereas in Breath of the Wild, you could walk by a hillside not realizing there's something significant right behind it. Which is why in the case of Breath of the Wild, the Zelda team expertly implemented high vantage points and paragliding to spot these secrets from afar. In the 3D installments before Breath of the Wild, Nintendo needed to be a lot more obvious with their secrets. There are some very well hidden ones in Ocarina of Time, but because Hyrule Field is so small and barren, you're still a lot less likely to miss them. Additionally, if you had a Rumble Pack, you had the option to use the Stone of Agony to track these secrets down. And because some of these secrets would have been close to impossible to find without the Rumble feature, none of the rewards are really all that special and only of real interest to the hardcore completionists out there. All in all, I think it's a wonderful thing that the 2D games still have their place in the Zelda franchise. They are not comparable to the mainline 3D titles, and that is exactly why these games should always make their stay. Sure, they might not generate the same kind of hype we find with the other games, but whether you like it or not, this is how Zelda started and how it pulled millions of people into the fandom. As of late, I've become a bit worried about the 2D installments. Even after the series made its transition into 3D, there was a time, especially in the 2000s, that we got a constant influx of amazing top-down Zelda games. We had Oracle of Ages and Seasons in 2001, Minish Cap, Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures in 2004, Phantom Hourglass in 2007 with Spirit Tracks following less than 2 years later in 2009. Then things started slowing down a bit more with A Link Between Worlds in 2013, and the last brand new top-down Zelda game we've gotten since then was Triforce Heroes in 2015. And yeah, we had Link's Awakening in 2019, but that's not a brand new Zelda game, but rather a remake of a game from 1993. I'm not necessarily against remakes, but I think I'm not alone in saying that I would have vastly preferred a new Zelda game in this style than a remake of a game I already played decades ago. Not only that, but by remaking Link's Awakening, Nintendo is setting themselves up for having to remake the Oracle games and maybe even Minish Cap now too. Development time which I would rather see go towards a new experience. And yes, I know these games are being developed by a third party, but that's not really an excuse. Capcom, which is also a third party, developed 3 amazing top-down Zelda games under the direction of Nintendo. 4 if you also count the first Four Swords game, which came bundled with the Minish Cap. Now that the 3DS has been discontinued and the Switch basically merged Nintendo's handheld and console market, I sincerely hope that the classic Zelda style of games aren't thrown by the wayside and demoted to mostly remakes. A good brand new top-down adventure is always a great experience and an excellent way to fill the void between the 3D installments, which usually only release every 4 to 5 years or so. And now for a channel update, because man, my voice is really starting to go. As some of you with a sharp eye may have noticed, there's now an additional button underneath my videos and on my channel page. Lid worden. Join. That's right, the gods of the Google sphere have deemed me worthy for channel memberships. So if Patreon isn't really your bag, but you still want to support the channel financially without having to go to a third-party website, then this option is now available. The memberships include similar perks like getting your name in the credits alongside my Patreons, early access to certain videos, if the deadline is lenient enough, and in the future I will do some behind the scenes stuff as well, like showing you how I make some of my videos, like the Hero's Path for instance, and maybe even little tutorials since, as an example, I get a lot of questions about how the 3D map of Breath of the Wild works in my animations. But of course, what really matters is you will gain access to 4 different emojis to use in the comment section of my videos and community posts. These include cat, dog, bald mummy Ganondorf, and of course we cannot go without the Zonai swirl. As of right now, I'm restricted to only 4, but these will be expanded later down the line as I gain more members. Again, I want to make it perfectly clear. You being here and watching my videos is already amazing to me, and I am not going to treat people differently in the comments and only respond or give hearts to members. This is purely for those who deem my channel worthy enough, I guess, for some additional support and have the means to do so. I also want to quickly mention that a Discord is now in the works. I still have a little bit of work left to do, but this shouldn't take too long. As it stands right now, I'm planning to open up the gates somewhere in the next 2 weeks. Also, since some people have been asking, the last Hero's Path episode is still in the works. If it were up to me, I would have released it earlier, but I also need to have consideration for the schedule of my co-host, who has been rather busy as of late. As not to paint myself in a corner with promises, I will just say for now, it will come out before the release of Age of Calamity, sooner rather than later. However, not next week, as that one will be reserved for a spooky, scary Halloween episode. This is my favorite holiday, so I definitely don't want to miss out on the first Halloween celebration on this channel. A big thanks for watching this video, and as always, a big thanks to my amazing Patreons. Since the Hero's Path videos didn't have any vocal shoutouts at the end, I have a bit of catching up to do, so please welcome Chris Woodall, Harm Dijkman, Sixala, Rocket Cat, Barky Doggo, Shigeako, Eric Turtles, Brick Colby, Patrick Montiath, as well as an additional mention to Didachu for upgrading their pledge. If I happen to have missed anyone, feel free to message me on Patreon and I will make it up to you in the next one. Thank you all so much for your support. I will see you in the next video. This is Don signing off, and have a good one.